The CEO fired his poor secretary only to find out she's the daughter of his biggest investor. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. On a Monday morning that seemed far too bright for what was about to unfold, the glass-walled boardroom at Sterling & Co. towered above the city like a throne room built for judgment. The sunlight spilled mercilessly across polished surfaces, catching on steel fixtures and the sharp edges of tension radiating from every corner of the room. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a battlefield, dressed in Armani suits and carefully combed hair, and at the center of it all sat Damian Sterling. Damian had built his empire from sweat, logic, and a ruthless intolerance for incompetence. The whispers said he had a heart as cold as the marble tiles that stretched across the penthouse floor. His word was law. His silence, louder than a courtroom gavel. Employees at Sterling & Co. had long since learned there were no second chances. Not here. Across the room, quietly clicking through the presentation slides from a sleek control panel, stood Helena Carter. Young, soft-spoken, dressed in department store neutrals, she was the kind of presence people missed even when she was right in front of them. To most, she was just the girl who brings the coffee, the secretary with too many post-it notes and not enough presence. But if anyone had looked closer, they might have noticed the steady hands, the meticulous notes, the spark behind those observant eyes. They didn't, especially not Damian. The investor presentation had begun smoothly. Slide after slide glided on screen like a well-rehearsed symphony, until it didn't. Just before the most pivotal section, the one that would determine a $200 million influx of capital, the screen went black. Then, an error message. Unsupported format. Please check source file. Silence consumed the room. Not the kind filled with confusion, but the kind steeped in expectation. Expectation of someone to blame. Damian turned, ever so slowly, the stillness more terrifying than any outburst. "Which file did you send?" he asked, his voice low, deceptively calm. Helena's fingers moved quickly over her laptop, her face composed but pale. "The final version, sir. I double-checked last night. I think there was a system error." Damian cut in, his tone slicing the air in half. "This is not a college internship. This is a billion-dollar corporation. We don't have the luxury of incompetence masked as excuses." Helena swallowed hard. "Sir, I really did." He stood now. Each step he took toward her echoed like a hammer striking glass. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "This is what happens when you hire for optics. No experience, no pedigree, but perfect for a diversity checkmark." His gaze swept over the room as if daring anyone to object. No one did. Helena stood frozen, not from fear, but from something else, something steadier. Her eyes never left his. They held no anger, no tears, just a dangerous kind of clarity. "You're fired," Damian said, cold as steel, final as a closing door. She closed her laptop with slow precision, nodded once, and walked out. No words. No scene. But the silence she left behind wrapped around the room like smoke. Lingering. Choking. Unforgettable. No one spoke for a full minute. And Damian, usually proud of his ability to clear dead weight quickly, felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. Regret? No. Not yet. But the feeling would come. And when it did, it would come like a storm disguised as a girl in gray heels, whose full name he had never bothered to learn. He would learn it soon, and it would change everything. 3 days after Helena Carter walked out of the Sterling and Cumber boardroom, the silence she left behind hadn't faded. It had deepened. It clung to the hallways, threaded its way through hushed conversations near water coolers, and settled uneasily into the corners of Damian Sterling's otherwise impenetrable mind. He had dismissed countless employees over the years. Some had wept. Some had begged. Some had slammed doors on the way out. None had haunted him. Until her. At first, Damian told himself it was irritation. An annoyance that the presentation had failed and the firm had lost face with a major potential investor. But that explanation unraveled the moment he received an email from IT. The subject line was ordinary, the content brief. It wasn't Helena's fault. The server hosting the financial files had undergone a silent failure during a late-night patch. The wrong version had been auto-synced and uploaded, not due to user error, but due to a technical oversight. He stared at the screen, read the report again, and again. His jaw clenched, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the familiar assurance that he'd made the right call. He hadn't just fired someone unjustly. He'd done it publicly, brutally. And he hadn't just ended a contract. He had humiliated her in a room full of eyes that wouldn't forget. But what unsettled Damian more than anything wasn't the mistake itself. It was the memory of Helena's face. Calm, steady, unflinching, not defiant, not frightened, just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that stays with you, that holds weight, that says, "You will remember this." And he did. On Thursday afternoon, as the team prepared for the arrival of a new high-profile investor, a reclusive global financier known only as Mr. Harrington, Damian found himself uncharacteristically restless. He couldn't name it, but something was off in the air. He adjusted his tie, stared out the windows of the conference room that overlooked Central Park, and tried to shake the lingering tension from his shoulders. He told himself it was just business, just another meeting. He didn't believe it. When Mr. Harrington arrived, every executive stood. He was tall, graying at the temples, but carried himself like someone who had walked through fire and come out refined, not charred. His handshake was firm, his gaze razor sharp. But he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him was a young woman dressed in muted navy, her hair pulled back, her heels measured in every step. She walked with quiet authority, like someone who had known invisibility and decided never to wear it again. Damian's breath caught in his throat before his brain even registered the recognition. Helena. Only now. She wasn't just Helena. She didn't stand by the door or shrink into corners. She walked in as if the room belonged to her. Mr. Harrington turned to address the team. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce my strategic partner in this investment. My daughter, Helena Carter. Helena. Damian blinked. Carter. The weight of her full name landed like a stone. The last name he had never bothered to ask. The entire room shifted, subtly but undeniably. Executives exchanged glances. Assistants paused their note-taking. A current of discomfort passed like static through silk. Helena turned toward Damian. Her gaze met his. This time, it was different. This was not the silence of someone dismissed. This was the composure of someone who had nothing left to prove. "You never asked who I was," she said softly but clearly. "You assumed." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Every word he might have said collapsed under the weight of the moment, and so the meeting began. But for Damian Sterling, it wasn't a business deal. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Damian sat at the far end of the table, his fingers laced tightly in front of him, not because he was preparing to speak, but because he needed to do something with his hands, something to keep them from trembling. Across the polished mahogany, Helena Carter sat poised, her tablet untouched, her attention unwavering. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. That somehow made the moment all the more unbearable, because she didn't need to gloat. The truth itself had already spoken for her. Mr. Harrington launched into the details of the proposed strategic partnership, a joint venture that could bring in the capital Sterling and Comer desperately needed after a string of bad press and waning investor confidence. He spoke with quiet precision, offering figures and forecasts with the calm of a man who is used to setting terms, not negotiating them. Helena chimed in occasionally, her insights sharp and well-timed. Damian noticed how each executive around the table turned toward her, not out of obligation, but respect. Real respect, the kind he had once refused to give. She was different now, not in essence, but in the way the room saw her. And yet, even now, Helena didn't once bring up what had happened days ago. She didn't so much as reference the firing, the humiliation, or the fact that she had been dismissed as a diversity hire with no credentials. She didn't need to. Her presence alone did what words never could. It rewrote the hierarchy in that room. When the meeting adjourned, the executives rose slowly, like they were waking from a collective dream. Conversations buzzed softly. Plans were made for the next steps in the due diligence process. Mr. Harrington shook hands with each department head, and then he turned to Damian and said with a neutral tone, "I trust you'll treat my daughter with the professionalism she's more than earned." Damian nodded, the words caught in his throat. Helena offered a brief handshake, her grip neither cold nor warm, just firm. She didn't linger. She didn't speak to him alone. She simply followed her father out, leaving behind the same silence that had haunted him since the day he fired her. That evening, Damian stood alone in his corner office as the sun dipped low behind the skyline. He watched the reflection of the city shimmer across the glass, but he wasn't seeing buildings. He was seeing her, Helena, the way she had looked at him in that moment, not with hatred, but with calm certainty, like someone who had once been beneath him and now saw him from above. He thought of all the years he had spent building walls around himself, of power, of status, of control, and how quickly those walls had started to crumble the moment one woman chose to walk out in silence rather than speak in anger. He had always believed silence meant weakness. Today, he understood differently. He walked to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and took out the HR file labeled Isabella Carter. It was thin, too thin. Her resume had been overlooked, her references barely glanced at. He flipped through it again, slower this time, reading every line. Graduate of Yale, interned at 2 global finance firms, fluent in 3 languages, volunteer work in underserved communities. Nothing about her was accidental. Nothing about her was mediocre. And he had reduced her to a clumsy girl with a bad file. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. "Board is asking if we move forward with Harrington." Green light? Damian stared at the screen. Then he typed back one word. Yes. But in his heart, he knew this deal wasn't just about saving his company anymore. It was about something else entirely. something he had never learned how to ask for until now, a chance to begin again, not with her approval, but with his own understanding of who he had become and who he might still choose to be. Of all the places Damian expected to feel unmoored, the rooftop of Sterling & Co. wasn't one of them. But there he stood, coat loosened, wind tugging at his sleeves, watching the early evening mist curl between buildings. The city below carried on in its usual hum, unaware that one man several stories above was beginning to feel the gravity of his choices in a way he never had before. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, believing that competence, power, and control were armor enough. But power didn't stop the ache that grew deeper with every echo of Helena's silence. And competence certainly hadn't stopped him from mistaking her for less than she was. The door behind him creaked open, and he didn't have to turn to know who it was. The soft footsteps were deliberate, unhurried. When Helena stepped beside him, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood a foot away, facing the same skyline, arms crossed over her chest, calm as the dusk descending around them. Damian glanced at her, but she didn't return the look. For a long moment, they both watched the world without acknowledging the space between them. When he finally found his voice, it was quiet. "You didn't have to come up here." "No," Helena replied, her tone even. "But I needed to breathe, and you're not the only one who knows this spot." Damian exhaled, more from relief that she hadn't turned away than anything else. "You were always more than what I saw," he said, stumbling slightly over the words. "That day, I didn't just misjudge your skill. I erased your presence." Helena's lips pressed into a line. She turned her gaze toward him for the first time, steady and unreadable. "You didn't erase me. You revealed yourself." That struck deeper than anything he'd prepared himself for. He looked away, ashamed. "I've spent a lot of time asking how I missed it. Everything about you. Your work, your mind, your restraint. And I think the answer is simple. I wasn't looking." Helena didn't soften. "You were looking, just in the wrong direction." The words hung in the air between them, not cruel, but heavy, honest. Damian nodded, the only response he could manage. "And now?" She studied him. "Now, you have eyes open. But the view's different, isn't it? Because you're not at the top of the tower anymore. You're standing beside the person you once thought would never reach it." He swallowed the sting of truth. "I don't want pity," he said. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I want to be better than I was in that boardroom. That's all I have to offer." Helena looked at him then, truly looked. And in her gaze was something that surprised him. Not warmth, not coldness, but a quiet clarity. The kind that sees through people, not around them. "Then do something with it. Not for me. Not to rewrite the past. But for whoever walks into your office next, not dressed like power, not sounding like certainty." He nodded again, slower this time. "I will." She turned to go, but paused at the door. "You once asked me why I wanted to work here. I never answered." He looked up, almost afraid of what would follow. "I didn't want your title," she said. "I wanted to see if I could build something meaningful in a place that had never seen someone like me as more than decoration." And then, with the quiet strength that had always defined her, she left. No drama. No dramatic ending. Just a woman walking away with her head held high, leaving behind a man slowly learning that real transformation doesn't come from power. It comes from being humbled by the truth and choosing, against every instinct of ego to stay present in its shadow. Under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the executive boardroom, silence had become more suffocating than any scolding. Damian sat at the long glass table, surrounded by a dozen high-level executives who once hung on his every word. Now, they avoided his eyes, skimming papers or checking watches, pretending the tension wasn't clawing at the walls. News of the company's crumbling reputation after the leaked incident had reached shareholders, clients, and the media. For the first time in years, Damian's name wasn't attached to words like visionary or powerhouse. It was tethered to failure, arrogance, and scandal. He should have seen it coming, but he hadn't. He hadn't seen anything clearly for a long time. Across from him, Rachel, his PR director, tapped her pen anxiously against a legal pad. "Damage control isn't enough anymore," she said, voice brittle. "This isn't just about your image, Damian. Investors are questioning the integrity of our leadership. Staff morale is at an all-time low. If this continues, we won't recover in the next fiscal year." Damian nodded slowly, absorbing her words like a man resigned to drowning, but still measuring the depth of the water. "I know," he said, his voice gravel low. "That's why we need to shift the narrative. Unless you're planning to donate your shares and resign," another executive snapped, "I don't see how a narrative shift is going to cut it." The room went cold. Damian didn't flinch. He wasn't the man who had fired Helena in public anymore. He had been unraveled since then, thread by thread. And now, he was simply someone trying to learn what remained. "I'm not resigning," he said evenly, "but I'm also not pretending anymore." He reached into the folder beside him and pulled out the printed screenshots Helena had delivered. Evidence of a coordinated campaign to tank his leadership and undermine the firm's public trust. It had taken him 3 days to stop feeling insulted by her silence and start understanding its meaning. She hadn't returned to offer absolution. She'd returned because she still believed in justice, even when it came at a cost to her peace. "These," he continued, passing the papers down the table, "are records of conversations between two major players at our rival firm, Bennett and Shaw. They intentionally seeded false information to discredit me, to discredit us." Stunned silence took hold. Papers were flipped. Eyes widened. Rachel looked up first. "Where did you get this?" Damian paused, holding her gaze. "Helena Whitmore." A ripple ran through the room, like a breeze hitting still water. Rachel was the first to speak again, this time softer. "She gave this to you?" She didn't have to, but she did. The room sat with that for a long moment. One of the older partners finally leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "And what now?" "Now," Damian said, his jaw tightening with a quiet kind of resolve. "We take responsibility, not just for what was done to us, but for what we've allowed ourselves to become. We've let this culture evolve into one where someone like Helena could be dismissed without a second thought. That stops here. We rebuild, not with branding, with substance." He didn't expect applause. He didn't receive it. But he saw something shift, small, almost imperceptible, in the expressions around the table. A sort of softening, a willingness, maybe, to follow a man who had once led through power and now might lead through truth. As the meeting broke, Damian stayed seated. He watched each person file out, shoulders heavier than when they had entered. He knew the hardest work wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. And Helena. She remained distant. She hadn't responded to his follow-up messages or acknowledged his attempts to apologize again. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she wasn't here to make him feel better. She was here to remind him of who he had failed to be. When the room was empty, Damian whispered to himself, "It's not about redemption anymore. It's about earning the right to change." And then he got up, loosened his tie, and stepped back into the fire he had helped light. Under the violet haze of a Los Angeles sunset, Helena stood at the edge of the rooftop terrace of the Whitmore Financial Group's West Coast headquarters, the city's pulse beating far below her. It had been exactly 2 weeks since she dropped the evidence on Damian's desk, the kind of information that could have dismantled Bennett and Shaw's credibility and salvaged the company she had once served as a nameless, voiceless assistant. Yet here she was, still haunted by the echo of the day she'd been humiliated. The moment had passed, but the wound lingered, less like a scar and more like a constant pressure beneath the skin. She hadn't spoken to Damian since. Not directly. She'd watched from a distance as the narrative around him began to shift. The media had quieted. Internal morale reports had stabilized. Investors were returning cautiously, like birds testing the strength of a branch that once cracked underfoot. She should have felt vindicated, maybe even proud. But instead, she felt suspended, as though the story was moving on without her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to chase it or let it go. That evening, her father, Henry Whitmore, appeared beside her. He didn't ask questions. He never had to. He just looked at her with the calm wisdom of someone who'd built empires and buried regrets. "You're waiting for something," he said, folding his arms. "I'm not sure what," Helena replied. Henry smiled faintly. "Forgiveness, maybe? Or clarity?" She turned toward him. "I don't know if he deserves forgiveness. Deserving it isn't the point," he said. "It's about whether you need to let it go for yourself." Helena didn't respond. Her silence wasn't uncertainty. It was caution. Trust, once shattered, doesn't get repaired with words or apologies. It's rebuilt slowly, moment by moment, and sometimes not at all. The next morning, an unmarked envelope was left on her desk at the firm. No name, no signature, just a simple handwritten note on cream stationery. "If you have any space left in your day, I'd like to show you something. Not to explain, not to ask, just to share." Damian, she stared at the note for a long time. Her first instinct was to crumple it, to refuse the invitation on principle. But something in the handwriting, uncertain, not perfectly balanced, felt real in a way nothing else from him ever had. Later that afternoon, curiosity quietly trumped caution. She arrived at the location he'd scrawled on the bottom corner of the note, an old warehouse space in the Arts District that had recently been gutted and transformed. When she stepped inside, she was met with a surprising sight: a vibrant co-working hub filled with natural light, reclaimed wood, and warmth. A stark contrast from the cold glass towers she was used to. Damian was already there, not in a suit, but in rolled-up sleeves, standing beside a group of interns giving feedback on mock startup presentations. He didn't see her at first. He was focused, listening, engaged, nodding without interrupting. When he finally caught sight of her near the entrance, his face didn't change with a smile or panic. He just gave her a small, grateful nod and motioned for her to wait. After the session ended, he walked over. This is what I've been working on, he said quietly. A mentorship initiative for underrepresented youth who want to enter finance but never see themselves in the room. We fund their education, train them, place them, and then we let them lead. Helena raised an eyebrow. Is this your redemption arc? He shook his head. No. This is just the beginning of what I should have been doing all along. You reminded me. She walked slowly through the open space, her fingers brushing the edge of a conference table made from salvaged wood. You didn't bring me here for thanks, she said. No, he admitted. I brought you here because no matter how much I change, none of it means anything if I can't face the person who showed me who I really was. Her eyes met his, unwavering. You were cruel, Damian. Dismissive. You reduced me to nothing in a room full of power. He swallowed hard. I know. And now? I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking if, maybe, you could see that I'm not that man anymore. The quiet between them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. Then Helena, after a long pause, simply replied, I see you're trying. It wasn't a door thrown open. It wasn't even an invitation. But it was something. A crack in the concrete. A thread pulled gently loose. And for Damian, who had once believed that status meant everything, it felt like the most honest beginning he'd ever known. The following days moved like slow tides, unhurried but inevitable. Damian continued building his mentorship initiative with quiet persistence. He didn't seek headlines or accolades, only action. For the first time, he was creating something that didn't hinge on power or profits, but on legacy, the kind that reached beyond his name. Helena watched it all unfold from a distance. She didn't involve herself, but she didn't walk away either. Some part of her had been waiting to see if this new version of Damian was a performance or a transformation. So far, it felt unsettlingly real. They didn't speak again until one rainy Thursday afternoon. Helena had just stepped out of a planning session when she found herself walking into the main atrium of the mentorship hub. The space smelled like old books and fresh coffee. She didn't expect to find Damian alone, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a young intern who was clearly on the verge of tears. Helena paused, hidden by the angle of a pillar, listening. The intern, a girl no older than 20, had a crumpled resume in her lap and eyes rimmed red. I don't belong here, she whispered. Everyone's so smart, so sure. I still get lost reading financial statements. Damian didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low, but firm. Do you know I used to fail economics? The girl blinked. Seriously? Dead last. 3 times in college. I had to beg to stay enrolled. He smiled, not with pride, but with honesty. What matters isn't that you're the best in the room. It's that you care enough to stay in the room even when you feel like you don't deserve to be there. The girl didn't reply, but something in her posture shifted. Not quite peace, but a seed of belief. Helena left without announcing herself, but the image stayed with her. The CEO who once ruled through fear, now sitting cross-legged in a hoodie, lifting a trembling voice with calm. That night, she opened a letter Damian had sent her, a real one, handwritten on thick paper. I'm not asking for a clean slate, it read. I'm asking if we can build something new, on different terms, brick by brick. You don't owe me your forgiveness, Helena. But if there's any place left where we could stand, not in the past, not in blame, just here, I'd like to try. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of love or redemption. just a quiet man trying to do right, and a woman learning to trust her instincts again. The next morning, Helena showed up early, not for Damian, for herself. She sat beside him on the mentorship floor as they reviewed applications for the new scholarship program. For hours, they said little, but their silences no longer carried resentment. They held possibility. Later, as they walked outside into the fading dusk, Damian turned to her. "You didn't have to come." Helena looked ahead, toward the soft orange glow bleeding through downtown LA's skyline. "No," she said, "but I wanted to." In that moment, there were no roles, no CEO, no secretary, no revenge. Just two people walking side by side in the direction of something uncertain but worth exploring. And maybe that was enough for now. The late summer air in Los Angeles carried a quiet softness, and for the first time in what felt like years, Helena allowed herself to breathe without holding back. Her days at the mentorship hub grew longer, but never heavier. The energy was different here. Students came with dreams, not demands. Ideas flowed without fear. And in between spreadsheets and proposals, something unexpected was beginning to take shape. Trust. Damian was different now. Not rebranded, not redefined, just refined, more grounded. His words had lost their edge, his presence no longer filled with the need to dominate a room. Instead, he observed more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was to uplift, not control. It didn't make him perfect, but it made him real. One evening, they found themselves working late, the office empty except for the two of them. Helena sat at a long table, sorting through profiles for a Women in Tech initiative she'd quietly proposed weeks ago. Damian, seated across from her, had removed his jacket, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly tousled in a way that made him look younger, unburdened. He leaned forward, watching her. "You really built all of this," he said quietly. Helena didn't look up. "So did you." He shook his head. "No, I had the resources. You brought the heart." She paused, hands stilling over a manila folder. There it was again. That vulnerability he didn't know how to weaponize, only offer. Carefully, she closed the folder. "I didn't come back for you," she said, her voice even. "I know," he replied, "and I'm not staying here, hoping you will." She finally looked at him. "Then why are you still here, Damian?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because being near you reminds me who I'm trying to be. Not for applause, not for redemption. Just because I want to become someone I can respect when the room's empty and the mirror doesn't lie." The quiet between them wasn't tense. It was honest. Helena stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the horizon, the way the city's lights bled into the dusk like watercolor. Damian joined her, not too close. "Do you ever wonder," she asked suddenly, "what we could have been if things had gone differently?" He took a breath. "Sometimes. But lately, I've started wondering what we still could be." Helena didn't respond. Not with words, but her silence didn't push him away. It held space for the question to exist, a silence that wasn't final, just incomplete. Later that week, the board convened to formally review Helena's proposal for a permanent leadership position at the hub. The committee, composed of external partners, watched with cautious curiosity. Some had seen her as the secretary. Others had heard the rumors. But none could deny what she had accomplished. Her data was irrefutable, her logic clear. But what silenced the room wasn't a number. It was a story. She told them about a girl who had been underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated, and how that same girl had chosen not revenge, but impact. How she had come back not to reclaim power, but to give it to those who had none. There were no objections. After the meeting, Damian caught up to her in the hallway. They said yes, he told her, though she already knew. Helena smiled, not wide, not triumphant, but soft and full. It was never about a title, she said. It was about being heard. Damian nodded. Then I hope one day I'll deserve to be heard by you again, as more than the man who failed you. Helena studied him for a moment. You're not the same man who fired me in front of a room full of strangers. And you're not the same woman who walked out without a word, he said. No, she agreed. I'm stronger now. And then she turned, walked away, not as a dismissal, but as a choice. A promise that her story was still being written. And maybe, just maybe, his name wasn't entirely erased from its pages. Under the warm amber glow of early evening, Helena sat in her office overlooking the Los Angeles skyline, the buzz of the mentorship hub slowly quieting as the day came to a close. It had been nearly 2 months since she was formally appointed as Director of Strategic Initiatives, a title she hadn't asked for, but one she had earned not through position, but persistence. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Where there had once been skepticism, there was now respect. Where whispers had once followed her down the halls, there was now the echo of trust being rebuilt. She leaned back in her chair, flipping through a report on one of the new youth leadership programs when a quiet knock came at the door. Damian stepped in, holding 2 coffee cups, one hand tucked in his pocket. He looked different, more at ease in his own skin, like a man who no longer needed the world's approval to define his worth. He offered her one of the cups. Cinnamon latte, he said with a faint smile. Your Monday evening favorite. Helena hesitated for a second, then took it. Thanks. You remembered. I remember more than you think, he replied softly. They sat in silence for a while. The only sound, the distant hum of the city below. Damian looked around the office, noticing the framed photos of students, the wall of sticky notes filled with handwritten goals and affirmations. This place feels alive, he said. You've built something remarkable here. Helena sipped her drink, not looking at him. It wasn't just me. It was the people who believed in what we could do differently. Damian turned toward her. I want to be one of those people, Helena. I know I was late to see who you were, but I see you now. Her gaze didn't soften. She had heard words like this before, too often from men who only recognized a woman's worth once it became undeniable. But there was something in his voice that didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply asked for presence. I'm not interested in rewriting history, Damian, she said calmly. What happened can't be undone, but it also shaped me, and I don't regret who I've become because of it. I don't either, he said. I regret how I treated you, but I don't regret the way you stood up to me. I needed that. I still do. There was a long silence between them, not tense, just full of the weight of things left unsaid. Helena set her cup down and looked directly at him. You want to be part of this? Then show up. Not for me, for the mission, for the people we serve. This isn't about redemption. This is about responsibility. Damian nodded slowly, accepting the terms not as punishment, but as clarity. Then I'll show up, every day, however I can. A faint knock interrupted the moment. One of the interns poked their head in, asking about a planning session for next week's fundraiser. Helena rose, giving Damian one last glance before grabbing her folder. "I'll see you in the conference room," she said. As she walked out, he followed behind, not as her superior, not as someone trying to reclaim a place he'd lost, but as a man who understood now that leadership was not dominance, but contribution. That night, after the lights dimmed and the building emptied, Damien remained behind in the volunteer lounge, helping a team of young staff assemble donation kits for an outreach event. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't speak like a CEO. He laughed. He listened. He asked questions. And when someone asked what brought him here, he didn't talk about his past roles or titles. He simply said, "I'm here to learn." In a world that often measured people by how loudly they led, Damien was beginning to discover the quiet, enduring power of humility. And Helena, watching from across the room, felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not forgiveness, not affection, but respect. Real, earned, steady respect. And in that respect, a new chapter was beginning to take root. Not built on power, but on presence. Not on status, but on service. On the morning of the official relaunch event for Hartwell Foundation's new youth leadership initiative, the Los Angeles skyline gleamed beneath a sky scrubbed clean by an early spring rain. Inside the venue, a renovated downtown art center, rows of seats were filling with educators, civic leaders, social entrepreneurs, and young students from across the city. The space pulsed with a kind of quiet, hopeful energy, the kind that made people lean in without knowing exactly why. At the front of the room, Helena stood backstage adjusting the mic clipped to her blouse, eyes scanning the final notes on her speech. Today wasn't just about unveiling a program. It was about setting a tone for the future. A future not just of policy or funding, but of human leadership rooted in empathy and equity. Outside the curtain, Damien sat in the third row. He wore no tie, just a dark blazer over an open-collared shirt, his posture composed but not rigid. He wasn't there as a guest of honor. He wasn't speaking or sitting at the head table. He was simply present. For weeks now, he had kept his promise, not with big gestures, but through quiet consistency. He arrived early. He stayed late. He asked more than he told. And over time, people stopped seeing him as the man who once fired her and started seeing him as the man who listened. The lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the audience. The host introduced Helena with a few short, warm words that didn't list all her titles, but simply called her a leader who sees people before she sees positions. Applause rose as she stepped onto the stage. Helena didn't stride. She didn't need to. She walked with the kind of assured stillness that draws attention not by force, but by gravity. She looked out over the crowd, and for a moment, her gaze landed on Damien. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But he met her eyes, and they both understood what that quiet recognition meant. This is who we are now. Helena began her speech, not with stats or projections, but with a story. A story of a young woman who once stood in a room full of power and was dismissed not for her failure, but for her perceived smallness. That young woman, she said, voice steady, was not weak. She was waiting for a world where she didn't have to shout to be heard. A long pause. Then she added, "And I believe we're beginning to build that world now." She spoke of the future they were shaping together, not as saviors, but as servants. Of how leadership today must not only look forward, but look inward at the biases we carry, the assumptions we make, the people we overlook until they surprise us with brilliance we should have seen all along. She didn't mention names. She didn't need to. The room felt it. The story had already been written into every gesture, every decision, every person present. At the close of her speech, Helena stepped down from the stage and didn't retreat to the back room. Instead, she moved through the crowd, greeting students, shaking hands with guests, pausing to laugh with a group of interns who had helped organize the event. When she finally made her way to Damian, they didn't embrace. They didn't exchange long apologies or promises. She simply said, "You made it." And he replied, "Wouldn't have missed it." Later, as the crowd thinned and twilight stretched over the city, they found themselves standing on the rooftop terrace of the venue, paper cups of lukewarm coffee in hand. The sky was streaked in orange and indigo, the buzz of traffic below soft and distant. They stood in silence for a while, watching the horizon. "I used to think leadership meant never letting anyone see you unsure," Helena said, her voice quiet. "Now I think it just means never pretending to be more certain than you really are." Damian nodded. "And I used to think strength meant control. But lately, it's been about letting go of that." She glanced at him. "Do you regret what happened?" "I regret who I was then," he answered without hesitation. "But not what I've learned from it, not who you've become." Helena looked away for a moment, thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if we'd have gotten here without it." "Maybe not," he said. "But I'm glad we're here now." They stood there a little longer, not as CEO and secretary, not as former adversaries, not even as a redemption arc come full circle, but as two people who had learned the hard way that real power comes not from being the loudest in the room, but from being the first to listen when it matters most. When they left the terrace, they walked side by side, not as equals in title, but as equals in respect. And that, more than any apology or accolade, was what made all the difference. Once upon a time, in a glass tower of power and polished pride, Damian Wolfe believed leadership was about control. Sharp suits, sharper words, and never showing weakness. Helena Monroe was just a name on a resume, a quiet secretary in the background, overlooked like wallpaper in a boardroom full of ego. But the world has a strange way of revealing truth, and sometimes the most powerful stories begin in the silence after a door is slammed shut. When Damian publicly fired Helena over a mistake that wasn't hers, he thought the matter was closed. He never imagined that the woman he dismissed would return days later not with vengeance, but with quiet authority, as the strategic partner of the very investor whose signature could save his empire. The tables didn't just turn, they flipped with grace. And in that graceful reversal, a new chapter began. One that unfolded not through revenge, but redemption. Helena never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence, her silence, her restraint spoke louder than any accusation. In a world that often glorifies confrontation, she chose conviction. She didn't destroy Damian. She let him face the mirror. She made him see the man he had become, and the man he still had the chance to be. And Damian, instead of doubling down, did something even rarer. He listened. He changed. He stepped back, not out of defeat, but to learn. He began to show up not to win, but to witness, to understand what real leadership required. Not dominance, but dignity, not speed, but sincerity. He stood before hundreds and bowed, not to her, but to the truth of who he had been and who he hoped to become. Helena didn't forgive him instantly. Real forgiveness isn't a performance, it's a process. But in time, through consistency and humility, he earned the chance to begin again, not at the top, but from the ground where integrity grows. What began as a scandal became a signal of a new kind of leadership, a new kind of strength. Together, they shaped something bigger than a corporate comeback. They redefined the meaning of voice, of power, of presence. And by the time Helena stood before a crowd and said, "I'm not here to dismantle anyone. I'm here to stand up," the story had shifted entirely, from a firing to a rising, from being underestimated to being undeniable, from a door closing to a door finally opening for something real. The lesson in their journey isn't just about business or pride. It's about the cost of assumptions and the quiet revolution that begins when we choose to see people fully. We live in a world where too many people are judged by where they start rather than who they are. This story reminds us that kindness is not weakness, silence is not submission, and the people we ignore today may be the ones leading us tomorrow. So look closely, listen carefully, and lead with heart. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that change is possible, that redemption is real, and that no one should be underestimated, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter, stories that stir the soul, and remind us that humanity is always worth believing in.